Now we move on to the Restoration colonies. The Restoration colonies were called that because this ties in with some English history. Charles II would be removed from the throne, and with their civil war, when Oliver Cromwell got put in charge, and all the stuff that you learn in world history. Well, Charles II gets restored to the throne, and so they call these Restoration colonies because they get established during this time period. The first one that we focus on are on the Carolinas. 1663, 8 nobles were given these tracts of land that made up the Carolinas. Now later on, 1792, the two Carolinas would split. So you have North Carolina and South Carolina. South Carolina is the profitable colony early on. They're the ones that are able to have success. They trade food. They have furs and food trade going on with the West Indies. They establish rice plantations, and they have economic success. North Carolina was not. North Carolina was poor. And in the North Carolina part, they tied in geographically more with actually the Chesapeake colonies, but they had small, self-sufficient tobacco plantations. The land was not that great, very swampy, no good harbors or bays in North Carolina, and so they didn't have the plantations that South Carolina did. So as a result, South Carolina definitely had more economic impact in that area, and was really a prize for England. There's a lot of wealth coming out of South Carolina. Notice here early on, as we're talking about the South, the southern colonies here, cotton's not in the picture. Don't worry about cotton until later, not until after the American Revolution do we start worried about cotton with slavery. It was not a major player at this point. We're focusing on rice, we're focusing on tobacco. All right, these are the players that we see in the Chesapeake, also known as the Middle Colonies, all down to the southern colonies of South Carolina and Georgia as well. Another Restoration colony that gets established during this time, 1664, would be New York. All right, originally James II, going back to King James II here, or now we're on to King James II, he decided to give this land to his brother, who is known as the Duke of York. The Dutch would have to give up Manhattan. All right, they had to get the Dutch to give up the Manhattan and Hudson Valley and what was known as New Amsterdam, and they were able to do so. Now, originally, King James II wanted to have pretty firm grip on this, and he wouldn't allow assemblies, but eventually they backed off. James II, though, believed that New York was too big originally, so he wanted to reduce that, and so you end up having New Jersey get developed from that. Land would be taken from that. They first originally had New Jersey divided into two, and that would eventually, and it was originally given to John Berkeley and George Carteret, and they would eventually sell it to the Quakers, and the two Jerseys would unite in 1702. And so New Jersey gets established. The next one to talk about is Pennsylvania. Again, Pennsylvania was the English government owed money to the Penn family, and so they were paid with Pennsylvania. William Penn would receive this, and they were Quakers. The thing about Pennsylvania is they believed in equality, and so William Penn had this holy experiment where they wanted to create a religious refuge and have a place of religious toleration. And so that's what happens. This is in 1681 when Pennsylvania gets established. Delaware would get established in 1702. You had some descendants, non-British descendants, who came in, and Penn would grant them land that would become Delaware. The last colony to talk about is Georgia in 1732. Why are we talking about Georgia in this situation? It's so much later than all the others. Why did England want to establish? The land wasn't great. Well, England, the purposes for settling Georgia and colonizing Georgia, there was two. The first, England wanted to create a buffer zone, a defense barrier between Spanish Florida and South Carolina. South Carolina had the wealthy rice plantations and the trade going to the West Indies. The British wanted to protect that. Georgia provided a buffer that would allow them some space to be able to protect the more wealthy South Carolina neighbor. And the other side was penal colony. There were some reformers in England that saw this as a great opportunity to send prisoners to Georgia. So that's how Georgia gets set up. The colony that we see get established first, not necessarily the colony in Georgia, but The settlement of Savannah would get established by James Oglethorpe. And there's some things here. This ties in with that reform movement, tied in with the penal colony. It's a very strict society in Savannah. There was no drinking rum, for example. And something that really catches a lot of people off guard is that Savannah, outlawed slavery. It wasn't allowed when it started up. Now, obviously, that would later move on, and Georgia would start to find some wealth along its coast. Rice plantations would also prop up, and they would adopt a similar plantation system that we see in South Carolina.